Welcome back to Guide to the Global Economy. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Geoeconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. Very pleased to be joined today by Ananya Kumar, Associate Director for Digital Currency at the Center. And Ananya, you wrote an excellent piece this week on e-CNY, which is the name for China's digital currency, a topic that has a lot of interest, not just here in the US, but around the world. And I wanted to take a few minutes to unpack your key findings from the piece.
Sure. Josh, let's just get started on what e-CNY is.
Yes.
It's kind of a new name for a currency that China's been developing for a long time now, since about 2017. So it's been 7-8 years. And it is a virtual form of their current currency, which is the renminbi. So it's really called digital renminbi, digital yuan, e-CNY. I like using the term e-CNY personally.
And just so folks know, CNY is how we would abbreviate like USD or EUR, and that's why it's called e-CNY.
Exactly. So China's been in what we call the pilot phase of their digital currency development, which means that there's about 250 million people in China currently that have access to the
This is a big pilot project.
This is a huge pilot project, and this is something we go back and forth on all the time, which is that what does it really mean to be in pilot? And I think China demonstrates that in many ways, which is that they're actually testing out the use of the currency across many different kinds of scenarios.
I just think that's such an important point because we track CBDCs all over the world and we say a country's in pilot or not in pilot. But China's really piloting, meaning seeing what works and what doesn't work, different things in different cities.
Yeah, and the piece just says that, China is using about 200 different kinds of scenarios.
Wow, across so many scenarios.
Yeah, across different cities, across villages to test out the capabilities of its e-CNY network. And these scenarios include things like digital ID integration. So People's Bank of China employees, which is the central bank of China, can actually have their trade union card, their identification card, and the ability to pay for lunch on the same card. And schools can do that as well. So you can do tuition payments, buy lunch, things like that. The other big sort of scenario being tested is in e-commerce or commerce-like functions. So you'll see a lot of popular websites like Meituan introduce e-CNY networks and also smart contracting functions into buying and selling things.
This is very advanced even compared to other CBDC work that happens.
It is, and this is why it's important to understand it as a whole network and not just like sort of a bearer instrument or a token itself, right? It's creating sort of networks of behavior that things that people do every day.
You have this excellent database in the piece folks should check out. You can search different use cases of e-CNY. But to push back a little bit, something we hear a lot is, well, hold on a second. Is there low usage of e-CNY? Is it actually not working? Is there a failure going on in the system? And it's hard to get data on this, but you look at this as well in the piece.
Yeah, and a little bit of research that we did about a year ago during the Beijing Olympics, we did the math on this, and it turned out that people had less than $4 worth of sort of e-CNY in their account, which really means that they're being either not used or people open accounts and forget about them.
If you have fewer than $4 equivalent, you're basically just opening it up probably and not using it.
Yeah, and I think maybe we need to rephrase the question about adoption in China a little bit. What I think China is trying to accomplish, at least domestically, is try and figure out these different functions of e-CNY and is not really focused on adoption. From the start, China's been like China's aim has been to compete with what are the private players in the market. And I think if it wanted to, it could push them out, right? But I think it currently wants to test out every kind of economic function that the e-CNY could potentially do.
I think this is such an important point because it's easy to look at that low adoption rate and say, oh, e-CNY is not working. Or there's another way to look at it, which is say China is piloting and testing, as you show in the piece. And when the piloting and testing is done, they have levers to pull from the PBOC, from the finance ministry to expand this and make sure this is adopted in the way they want. And my perspective is they just haven't reached the phase yet where they have the technological model they want yet to pull those levers. We'll see. I mean, it's something we'll track.
So China's been in the pilot phase for about 4 years now, since 2019. But last year and this year are when we've seen the scenarios come up a lot more. So we kind of are positing that China is ramping up these scenarios and experimentation. But of course, this is not the only part of e-CNY that we talked
Right.
about. I'll talk about. There's a lot of conversation in DC about what are the wholesale implications of e-CNY and how it could matter to countries outside of China.
Well, I'm just glad you said this because this creates a lot of confusion in Washington. We spent a lot of time talking about this. Retail CBDC, retail central bank digital currency, is how, whether it's in China or in the Eurozone or in the US one day, in a digital dollar, you would buy a cup of coffee using a liability of the central bank like paper cash. So it's how people like you and me would use the currency. But wholesale CBDC is a different ballgame altogether. That's how banks exchange money between themselves. And China has both projects, like a lot of countries do. So retail is e-CNY, as we just talked about, and wholesale has different components to it. The most prominent project is mBridge, which we can talk about. But the basic idea is, how do you transfer money between Chinese banks domestically and between Chinese banks and other countries' banks? And this has important geopolitical implications, since we've spent a lot of time both here in the Geoeconomics Center in the US, thinking about how banks transfer money to each other since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions. But maybe you can tell us a little more about mBridge, because I think that's probably China's most interesting project in the wholesale space.
Sure. And so the mBridge is a project between China, the central banks of UAE, Thailand, and Hong Kong, along with the BIS Innovation Center in Hong Kong, which really is looking at a platform to compete with what are correspondent banking networks, right? So correspondent banking networks are how your money gets sent to a different country currently. It does not rely on direct connections between banks. It relies on sort of indirect connections between banks. And as the argument there is that it tends to be a lot more inefficient, takes a lot of time, is very costly depending on where you live.
And also always uses the dollar.
And always uses the dollar.
Yeah.
Yes, a big part of sort of international movement of money is in dollars, more than 90%.
Right.
So platforms like the mBridge look to create a different solution and connect banks in Thailand, for example, to banks in China without really touching the dollar.
That's pretty interesting. And they just did the first successful test. It was somewhere near $20 million, $22 million.
Yeah.
I don't think until then we had seen wholesale central bank digital currency have actual money transferred. A lot of conceptual work done,
Yeah.
but nothing actual where real money was settled cross-border until a few months ago.
Yeah, and the cross-border is the important part here, right? Because I think we had experiments coming out of France and other places that were looking at platforms within the country to settle account balances, but nothing really that changed currencies or created a platform to do that.
My perspective is that while China's domestic retail project, e-CNY, gets a lot of attention, from a US perspective, it's actually much more important to pay attention to the wholesale project. Because if you're worried about how the dollar's used internationally, specifically how it's used in sanctions enforcement, it's that wholesale cross-border bank-to-bank project which really presents some more near-term risk and challenge.
I partly agree with you, Josh. So
Okay.
I do I do think that these wholesale projects are really important and create sort of an alternate network to the existing SWIFT infrastructure and things that we're currently relying on. But I do think that the domestic e-CNY still has implications internationally, right?
Okay,
Because
how so? That's important.
I think that when central banks try to create these networks, they rely on existing infrastructure, and e-CNY is an existing domestic infrastructure that has the possibility of getting replicated even in the wholesale space, both technologically but also regulatorily.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, because a lot of people say, oh, well, China's currency is not going to be internationalized, capital control, so therefore their digital currency has the same restrictions, which I agree with that point. But there's a difference between e-CNY being replicated all over the world versus the technology behind e-CNY being modeled for other countries that want to build it. And that's an important distinction.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point. So already when mBridge's paper came out, we actually saw that most of the currency issuance and redemption was in e-CNY because that was already a network that existed and it was easy to convert from the platform.
Right.
And the imagination of mBridge is to connect it to more countries. The sort of vision is that the network could expand and include more countries themselves. But Chinese companies who are involved in the creation of e-CNY are also just privately selling their products to other countries and saying, hey, we have a model that's built in. We've been working on it for a long time. Why don't you try it out?
I think it's so important what you said about expanding the network and the ambition, because we've heard from the People's Bank of China, you don't even have to have a wholesale CBDC to be part of the network, which raises all sorts of
Yeah,
technical questions we won't get into today. But the broad point is that the ambition is to expand it, as you
expand
said.
it. Yes, I completely agree, and that carries over the sort of baggage of domestic e-CNY, this concern that we have over surveillance and control. I think exists internationally as well.
Now, we spend a lot of time focusing on China. Your piece is on China. We work a lot about China. We get a lot of questions about China at the Geoeconomic Center. But I think it's important to say they are one of 114 countries exploring CBDC. So just to take a step back for a minute
Yeah.
and balance out the perspective on CBDC.
Yeah, and they're one of 60 that are in the pilot development or launch stage. So really countries that are in the advanced stages of looking at CBDC development. The big example that comes out is the ECB,
Yeah.
which is looking to also release a pilot later this year, both on the wholesale but also on the retail side.
Yeah, the Eurozone being in pilot is a huge deal.
Yeah.
You know, arguably from a US perspective, as impactful, if not much more impactful than China's e-CNY project, because we assume, you know, what they come up with in terms of privacy protection, cybersecurity, and how they work with their banking system will be much more applicable to a US context than
Yeah.
what China's doing. I do want to bust just one more myth about CBDC
Yeah.
while we're talking about this. Intermediation, to use a wonky term,
Yeah.
because one thing we hear a lot about CBDCs is can't do it because it's going to cut out the banking system. But we don't see that at all at our research.
No, we don't. So we look at about 120 countries. 114 of them are in the process of developing a CBDC. And in all 114, 0 countries are looking at a non-intermediated model. And what that means is that no country is really looking at a model that takes away bank deposits.
I just want to underscore this point.
Yeah.
So to everyone listening who we hear all this myth about CBDC, it's going to undercut the banking, of the 114, 0, including China,
including China,
disintermediate their banking system. So there are a lot of things to talk about CBDC, risk with CBDC that are legitimate. I think what we've seen, there's just absolutely no risk of, you know, the banking system getting cut out of this process. And in fact, some banks can benefit from it.
Yeah. And in some instances, we're seeing early evidence of deposits increasing in banks because of CBDC rollout. But it's really too soon to tell about that.
Yeah, it's early. We don't know. It's different types of countries. But the point is there's a lot we don't know about CBDC and a lot we'll find out. I want to talk about one more thing, which is the hot topic in Washington, it seems, this month, de-dollarization, which has a connection to digital currency work, but is also broader than that. A lot of countries, you know, making announcements. They're going to invoice things in renminbi. Where does e-CNY or China's digital currency fit into this de-dollarization conversation?
Right. So de-dollarization or yuanization, or really taking away power from the dollars, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar away from it, has sort of been in vogue for a long time. And we work on it across a whole range of issues, which includes sanctions, illicit finance, anti-money laundering issues as well. I think when this paper talks about it a little bit, but I think when it comes to the e-CNY, the reasons why you don't want to hold renminbi in paper form are the same reasons why you wouldn't want to hold an e-CNY.
Doesn't fix that problem.
It doesn't fix the problem, and the problem is of liquidity and capital controls. So the reason the dollar works is because it's solid. I always say the dollar is liquid because the dollar is solid because it's liquid.
Yeah,
right.
I like that.
Yeah,
that's a good phrase. Yeah.
So it's and the renminbi is not. So you're not going to sort of switch away from a currency if it doesn't provide you all benefits. Now that does not mean that countries are not going to sort of create swap channels or try and use nostro accounts, things like that. But I think that's going to happen in the margins and not you know, take away all of dollars transactions.
I agree with you, and I think that we should look at the increase in wholesale CBDC exploration, which has really rapidly increased since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions, not necessarily as an immediate threat to the dollar, as a signal that countries would like to find ways to work around dollar-based transactions if they can. Doesn't mean they're there yet, but boy, they are interested in doing it. They're spending a lot of time and money doing it. And if they figure it out, it could be a big deal, maybe not for how the dollar is used globally, but how we use the dollar specifically in the national security context.
Yeah, and I think when sort of geopolitical tensions or fragmentation already exists, technology can provide a tool to sort of achieve your national security benefits, right? So I think that's what countries are doing in many instances.
So final point,
Yes.
since we have avoided it so far, the U.S. Where are we on this
I
digital
don't know.
currency issue?
I don't know if we've avoided it. I think if we say China, the next sort of image in my head is the US. We've seen a lot of positive signals lately, both from the Treasury Department and the Fed, on wholesale development of a digital dollar, which could create positive standards for privacy and cybersecurity, sort of the two big issues we're concerned about.
Yeah, it's so interesting. On the one hand, we're talking about the geopolitics of wholesale and bank-to-bank transfers. And then on the other hand, of course, not connected in any way,
Yeah.
the US is getting more involved in wholesale central bank digital currency, Project CEDAR, which is a project at the New York Fed with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. We don't see as much action from the US on the retail side, but as you said, there's certainly things going on the cross-border wholesale side, and I think it's a positive.
And we haven't ruled out a retail digital dollar yet either. So I think there's still more to come there.
I agree. We'll see what the European Central Bank does, what the Bank of England does. That'll probably have an enormous influence on the Federal Reserve and what the US decides to do.
Yeah, I agree.
Ananya, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for writing the piece.
Thank you for having me, Josh.